Good morning and welcome to PWGC's Environmental Echo. I'm your host, Paul Boyce, CEO and President of PW Grosser Consulting. And today, as always, we're bringing you guys another very exciting and interesting topic. We're going to be talking to Kevin Hoogerhyde from Alpha Analytical, an environmental lab that we work with, I'm going to say daily at this point. It doesn't end. It's, we collect environmental samples, we bring them to a lab, they run the results they analyze everything and give us the results, and we get to see what the heck's going on out there in the world. So, you guys, this is going to be a really important topic, so I hope you enjoy it. But before we start, I do want to say the best way to reach us, if our listeners, anyone out there wants to get in touch with us, is through our website, which is www.pwgrosser.com/podcast. And if you guys have ideas, thoughts, concerns, topics, or you want to be a guest or anything like that, please reach out to us. Remember, everything is generally environmentally focused, so that's the topic. But yeah, reach us through the podcast or the website app there, and we'll get right back to you as quickly as possible. We've got some really responsive folks back in the office who take care of that. But getting back to our guest, we got Kevin Hoogerhyde, who is a Vice President of Technical Sales at Alpha Analytical, Inc., and you guys are based out of Massachusetts, correct?
Correct.
And which town in Massachusetts would that be?
We actually have two facilities, one in Westboro and one in Mansfield.
I'm familiar with the Westboro one, mainly. All right. Okay. Well, we've been partnering with these guys for several decades now, and they've provided excellent service to us every time we call on them. They've provided testing services for every type of project we've done under the sun. That's where it's involved soil, water, air testing, and everything in between. We can go on and on. But Kevin's got more than 40 years of experience in the environmental analytical laboratory field, including operations management, methods development, and project planning and design. So, Kevin, welcome. We're glad to have you here today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and it's great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Also joining us, we got a repeat offender. We've got Kris Almskog, who's a professional geologist and also a senior vice president at PW Grosser, and he heads up our environmental compliance division with Marianne Ashworth, who is not here with us. So, Kris, you've been with us for over 20 years also. And as I mentioned in previous podcasts, you started out as a wee little bitty intern.
I did.
Now you're a great big senior vice president. So
it's been a great run, and thank you for having me. And nice to be on with Kevin, who I've known now for, like you said, probably 2 decades, and we worked very closely together on numerous projects and the relationships. The relationship, one of the things we'll get to with the lab is so important for consultants to have a reliable lab that you can talk to before the project, during, and afterwards to really understand these samples, what it means, and how to use it most effectively.
Absolutely. So, let's just get right into our conversation today, and I briefly touched on it in my introduction about, Alpha being an analytical lab, but can you give us really an explanation of who you guys are, Kevin, and what your primary, your mission is?
Sure. So we are an environmental testing lab, as you had mentioned. What we do is we analyze soil, water, air, biological tissue, a variety of different matrices for hazardous chemicals. So that could be, benzene, lead. I could go down a list of hundreds of different chemicals and things like that. But those analyses are performed in the laboratory. We use different types of analytical instrumentation to do that, and then that information is then conveyed to you, right, the consultant, in terms of the results that you then compare to criteria that you're evaluating the data against. So it depends on what kind of program you're working under, or what you're doing with the information and the data.
Absolutely. So in terms of the environmental sampling, right, and you mentioned a bunch of them, the soil, water, air, what do you do the most of? What do you do the least of? Where do you guys really focus? Where do you spend most of your time? Is it soil, water, air? Is it a three-way split? You mentioned the tissue samples. I know we've caught crabs and stuff like that. Right. Had to blend them up and, real fun stuff, but I got to do it.
Yeah, I would say the majority of the analysis is probably soil. That just happens to be, in terms of our practice, what we typically analyze most. 75% maybe soil if you're going to split it. There's also a lot of vapor testing that's done, a lot of air testing. What you find with environmental programs and sampling programs is that you pretty much hit three of the matrices all the time. So you're going to look at soil, you're going to look at groundwater, and you're going to look at some type of vapor matrix, either soil vapor or ambient air, indoor air. So when we do a project, or we look at a sampling scope, you're going to look at pretty much all three of those matrices.
So and another thing that we sample with, and I don't know I think we may have to go to other labs, but it's like some of the bacteria. Do you guys do the bacteria and algae and all that stuff, or you sub that out when we send it to you?
Yeah, so that brings up a very important part of the analytical process. So these analytical methods or parameters have what we call holding times.
Yep.
And depending on the stability of the either the chemicals or the parameters that you're testing for, they will have the ability to survive in that sample bottle for a certain period of time. Or, when I say survive, I'm talking about the bacteriologicals.
Yep.
With chemicals, you're talking about, potential breakdown of those, those chemicals into other products. So what you want to do with an environmental sample is you want to preserve the integrity of that sample until it gets to the laboratory for analysis. So you get a clear picture. So you as a consultant get a clear picture of what is actually happening on the site. And for bacteriologicals, you brought that up, right? Algae and, let's say coliform or something like that. It has a very short holding time. So we're in Massachusetts. It takes a little while to get there. We do transport samples every day.
Yep.
The samples that are collected today are in the lab this evening, but not in enough time to get the bacteriological samples done in certain circumstances.
And those things are dictated by the EPA method and the holding time.
Oh, yeah. Correct.
And so as consultants, we work with a number of labs as well. And
right.
For certain things, such as even certain soil testing for sieve analysis, or we do asbestos testing. So Alpha has their specialty that, we use you a lot for the hazardous materials and things like that. But some of the bacterial and asbestos and mold, we might use other labs as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are different practices that the laboratories may specialize in. And some of those we don't support.
Well, you brought it up as a transport service. What I really like working with you guys is you say, call you up, say, Kevin, I got to grab some samples for XYZ, and you guys will meet us on site the next morning with the appropriate sample bottleware or glassware to collect those samples. And, whether or not we're sampling them right then and there, you'll either wait until we have them, you'll take them back, or you'll actually come back later in that day and meet us on site and take our samples and get them up to your lab, which is, to us, that's invaluable.
Right. So that is actually, when you look at the laboratory operations, so you have different aspects of analysis that occur within the laboratory depending on what class of chemical you're dealing with. But pretty much every laboratory, I would say every laboratory, has this department called the either logistics or the bottle prep department, where we have where the methods that Kris, you had mentioned before, EPA methods, dictate what type of bottleware the sample needs to be collected in. In some cases, there needs to be preservatives in the bottles, and there's a department within the laboratory that actually prepares those, sometimes referred to as kits or sampling kits. So though that operation of the laboratory can kind of be duplicated in various parts of the country, for instance. So we have a service center in North Jersey, Alpha in particular has a variety of different service centers, and that service center's function, their main function, is to provide the glassware, the pickup, the logistical support that's needed in support of your projects and support of the field operation. So,
yeah, I mean, it's been fabulous working with you guys in that respect.
thank you.
It also kind of that step and when it eliminates, using older glassware that could be cross-contaminated. And also the pickup, what it does is it reduces the number of people involved in that chain of custody, which, when you do take a sample, especially if it's a high-priority project and there's a chance that the data may be questioned, each time you're handing that sample off to someone, it's under a different chain of custody. And occasionally you need to ship things via FedEx. And when it's being shipped, you don't have that same control. So what I like, too, is just that, if B2B Grocer is not delivering something to a lab, dropping it off, your person is picking it up, and it really reduces the number of hands that are touching those samples, those coolers, and therefore the validity of it, it stays. That's very important to us as consultants, that the data is usable. So
Right. Yeah, and once we take possession of it, it's our responsibility from there until you get the report
Get
in
the
your
results.
hands. That's
Yeah.
right, correct.
Well, you mentioned something else. So it's always very interesting to me is like holding times, and we understand we're not your only customer or client, right? So how do you manage that in a lab? You've got, a finite number of technicians and machines, and you can only process so many samples at once. How do you avoid, our sample sitting there beyond the holding time in your lab if everybody's looking, a few years ago there was a rush on lead in drinking water samples.
Right.
How did you not that lead had a holding time that was, like 6 months or something?
6 months, correct.
But if it was something else like that, that's all of a sudden it's a hot topic and it's got a shorter holding time, how do you manage that?
Well, a lab has capacity, right? It has limited capacity. One of the things that helps with that whole process is what we call a lab information management system. So, LIMS for short. So everybody kind of throws that term around all the time.
I like that.
But what that helps do is it helps keep track of scheduling. So really, the whole process of the analysis begins when that sample is logged into that management system. So the sample is, you provide some type of identification from the field. The laboratory assigns it a laboratory number. That sample then gets logged into the system, and the analysis that was requested gets put into the system. Now, programmed into that is some logic in terms of holding time, in terms of, work lists, everything from that level to the point of, instrument calibration and reporting. So that's really the brain, the nervous system
Well, that's
of
what always,
the laboratory.
it makes you feel comfortable, but every time I submit stuff that's got a short fuse on it, I'm always like, man, I hope they're not busy. I hope not anyone else is pressing for a 24-hour turnaround or something.
And that information system helps us to manage that, so that if we are busy, or let's say that we have, we're concerned about reaching capacity, we can reach out to you and say, hey, we may either have to reach out to another laboratory for support, or, you could make the choice on your own to, let's say, use another laboratory that you work with that isn't, is not necessarily facing the same challenges, but that system helps keep track of all that.
And then the first step, one of the key steps, again, is the relationship between the consultant and their multiple labs or vendors. And one of the things that we do in-house is when we have a large order or a time-sensitive order, we will call Alpha and say, we have this coming in, next week. Can you handle it? Is it going to put too much of a stress on your system? Because, again, for us as consultants, we want to satisfy our clients' needs, their time demands. And, and we want to know if that is going to put too much stress on you or any other lab. We might split it up the sample or send it different places. So, again, that's part of the relationship between the consultant and their vendors, their labs, their kind of trusted team to kind of have those discussions up front, which is very common that when we have rush orders, we will get on the phone with Kevin and his associates and say, this is coming down the pike. Can you handle it at this time? Is there anything we should do differently so you can handle it? And it's very honest back and forth with when you can and when you might be at that limit and it'll be putting too many stresses on it.
Right.
So.
And as a laboratory, we certainly
Yeah.
appreciate that. And, I've mentioned this to you numerous times, Kris, we appreciate that from your folks. You do see the laboratory as an integral part of the team, which is important. It's important in terms of data integrity. It's important in terms of sample integrity, that we understand, your project, you understand where we're at, and we work together. So it's always been appreciated with working with you folks.
And historically, I've been on due diligence property transaction projects where they are closing on a certain date. They're closing on Friday. They need that data.
Right.
And I'd go around, I'd ask the lab, if we take the sample on Monday, can we get the results by Thursday? And it's happened more than once where the results were not in my hand and that property transaction was put off. And so that's why, the honesty between vendors is so important. Can you supply it or can't you? If you can't, that's fine. I'd appreciate an honest answer and we'll figure it out. But that's it's something very important for consultants to have that open line of communication.
Well, you started off with its relationships,
Yeah.
so it is important to have a good relationship from us as the consultant with the environmental lab or labs. So it really does start with that. Another topic we wanted to touch on was data validation, right? So we get tons of data. We get all sorts of different things about all spikes this and blank this, and I don't even know what half of the stuff means, and I'm supposed to interpret this. How do you guys manage the data, Kevin, and can you explain to us why data validation is important, what it is?
That's a huge that's probably enough for another podcast.
You got 20 seconds.
20 seconds
What's
to
the
answer that
elevator
one?
speech?
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's really, I guess there's a couple of different aspects to data. One is really set by you as the consultant in terms of what's the expectation for the data. What are you using it for? And I think that's really the main question, or I guess the main focus initially is, what are your objectives with the data? What's it going to be used for? Is it, a first look at a site? Are you doing, a preliminary investigation? Are you closing a site? Is it, routine monitoring? Once that's established and determined, then there is generally what we call a QA project plan that's developed that kind of lays out what those expectations are, what the limitations are in terms of, all those things you talked about, the spikes, the internal standards, all of that,
blah, blah, blah,
stuff.
blank.
So, the next step is really determining usability of the data, which is not necessarily validation, because usability has to do you're dealing with samples that are not pristine. You're not taking clean drinking water samples, so there are challenges with the analysis that occur. There's interferences. You may have a high concentration of one component that's interfering with another, and so you really have to then look at the data and say, okay, based on these indicators, these quality indicators like field blank spikes, all that stuff, is the data usable? Is the data usable for what I intended to use it for? That is done really on your level. You could engage a data validator in that. The data validation process is probably a step even beyond that, where you're looking at things like, was the instrument calibrated properly? Did the analysis occur within holding time? Are there excursions from the method that occurred that would yield this data invalid? Was there enough of an excursion from the method that the consultant would have to say, I can't use this data? I really, it's not valid information. So that's kind of the steps in the process of data from the data user, you being the data user.
That's us, the end user.
Right,
Yeah.
the data user, and what you do to evaluate that data.
Let's help clear it up for me.
Yeah. And originally we get the data. We'll take a first look at what the findings are, And then, later on we dive down deeper into how it was done, if anything was outside the holding times and things like that, to question, to basically say how tight and how usable is that data. And once it gets presented, could anyone kind of call it into question?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest part of it too, is to take a look at, can the data be questioned because of these occurrences? The methods have limitations. So the methods, when they're developed, are developed using actual samples. There's a validation process that occurs with the method with other, laboratories. There's usually a lab validation or a method validation step in the process. And so these limits are based on actual environmental conditions. That information is what you use, and that information in the method is what you use to evaluate the usability of that data.
All right. Well, moving along, and here's something that I absolutely have to bring up, it's the emerging contaminants, right? We talked about this on numerous other podcasts, but we finally got the lab guy in here, so obviously PW Grosser, we've been dealing a lot with the PFOA, PFAS, the 1,4-dioxane, and who knows what else is coming.
Some personal care products, things like that.
Everything, right?
Right.
So, how do you guys adapt as these things start to evolve and these new compounds are now being regulated? And, a lot of them, even you mentioned the methodologies, some of them don't really have a standard methodology. Right. You go from lab to lab or place to place, and it's different. And, am I still getting apples to apples, or am I getting oranges to apples? What are you guys doing with the emerging compounds, or contaminants rather?
Well, I think when you look at anything, let's say on the horizon in terms of contaminants, from a commercial lab standpoint, there's always the business aspect of it. Is this a flash in the pan, or is this actually going to take hold and, be something that needs to, that will progress into something viable in terms of a business unit within the laboratory. And sometimes these things are on the horizon and they're not quite there yet. So it's kind of a little bit of a balancing act. With the perfluorinated compounds, we saw other things developing within the industry. Right, there were lawsuits that were starting to occur. There was more of an awareness of these, and so we decided to get into the market 2 or 3 years ago. There's also initial financial outlay. So in the case of the perfluorinated compounds, these are very difficult things to analyze for. And a lot of times what you'll find is, in terms of environmental contamination, when you look at these chemicals or compounds, sometimes the things that make them so versatile is also what makes them extremely difficult to analyze and extremely difficult to treat and remediate, right? So you look at perfluorinated compounds, they're in everything. I'm probably wearing them today, and what the challenges are in trying to treat them and get rid of them. Well, we face some of the same challenges in the laboratory, and there is sometimes a barrier to getting into the market because of the cost of the instrumentation or the cost of setting up the laboratory. And it's understanding what those limitations are. An instrument to do perfluorinated compound analysis runs $500,000, for one instrument, but you also have to understand that the limits on these things are also very, very low. So now you have to look at the environment in the laboratory. What are your analysts wearing? What kind of preparatory area do you have? You're dealing in levels that are, part per trillion.
That's right.
Levels. So the whole design of the operation and the analysis has to focus on, what are you analyzing for and how low are you going?
Which, in addition to what the lab does, the sample technician, or just even sampling it, what clothes is he wearing?
The field
what
guys,
type what type of pen? How is that well installed? All those questions come into effect when you go to sample it. And was the sampling methodology, did potentially put cross-contamination in that sample again, since parts per trillion you're looking at is such a minute, tight little standard to achieve. All that plays into effect.
Right.
Our listeners, just to give them a perspective, parts per million, right? Think of $1 million, single dollar bills. We're talking $5 or $10 out of $1 million. All right, then you go to 1 billion, which is 1,000 million. Right? I got 10 parts per billion, so I've got $10 out of 10 billion singles. Right? It's like talk about needles in a haystack, and then trillion, which is 1,000 billion, which is 1,000,000 million. People, it's so low of a number that you guys are trying to analyze for. I don't even know how you find it when you're doing this stuff.
Well, I draw there's a lot of analogies out there in terms of what's a part per trillion, and I think just you use dollar bills. I thought of it in pennies.
Yeah,
it's easy to it's easy to imagine 100 pennies on the table, and one of those pennies is a part per 100.
Yeah.
Now you're going to a part per quadrillion, and if you had or a part per trillion, if you had 1 trillion pennies, it would be about 25 tons of pennies. So that's not going to fit on your kitchen table. No. But it would be, if you were looking at part per trillion, it would be one of those pennies out of those 25 tons of pennies. So, it's a small part of the whole, but there is technology and instrumentation that's able to detect that. And a lot of times, in most circumstances, you go through a preparatory step in the method where you take the sample and those compounds are either extracted by some type of technique, and then a concentration occurs in that step, and then it's introduced onto the instrument. So sometimes it's not, you're not looking at it in an ambient sample. You're doing some type of preparatory step in the process. And then, Kris, you brought up cross-contamination, which is a huge, part of consideration when you're sampling. And it's not just for low levels. I mean, what we found recently over the past couple of years with COVID is that people taking, let's say, ambient air samples are using hand sanitizer. So, you have the alcohol in the hand sanitizer. It's volatile. It's ending up in
the room there,
in the air sample, and it's masking what you're looking for in the sample. So we've seen a lot of that over the past couple of years. So it's all of those types of considerations as part of the process in taking an environmental sample that, so you don't introduce something into the sample that you don't necessarily want there. And the lower the concentration and the more prominent that chemical is, like perfluorinated compounds, the more likely it is to possibly introduce that into the sample.
Well, on the other side of things, we talk about sometimes you have to dilute a sample to get a result. We recently had a client who had a propane leak in his home, and the propane was, we took the air sample with the Suma canisters, we brought them to you guys, and it was off the charts, and you had to dilute. Can you explain to us the whole dilution process and how that works? Because now the sample's just so rich, it's beyond your instrument's range of I don't want to say detection, but you peg a needle and you don't know what you really got.
Correct. Yeah, and that can occur if you have one particular component of the sample that is in a very high concentration. So the instrument has a limit, or what we call a range of analysis, from a low concentration to a higher concentration. In some cases, you will have a situation like you just explained with one particular component of the sample kind of exceeding the limit of the instrument, and for that particular analysis, and that will result in having to dilute the sample so that you bring the concentration of the sample within the range that the instrument is operating in.
So how do you know how much to dilute it by? If, thing, like I said, we peg it out. We're off the range. Do you cut it in half? Do you cut it in a quarter, a tenth? What's the process?
Sometimes the instrument can give you some hints. Sometimes, and it's the experience of the analyst too. You will get some type of response from the instrument. You will see it. It's not always necessarily like reading a gauge where the needle, pegs and stays there.
Okay.
The instrument will give you some type of response, and based on the experience of the analyst, they may look at it and say, well, in the past, I've seen this type of response, so I know I have to make a 5-time dilution, or I have to dilute this sample 10 times or whatever. And sometimes it's just hit or miss.
Yeah, so we go in and we cut it by 5, and it's still
too far, right? Yeah, and that happens.
I know. That's like I said. That always fascinated me, is how do you guys decide? Because we're not calling the shots at that point. It's entirely up to you, and we're relying on you guys to tell us. So that's interesting. It's a little bit of not so much. It's a little bit of art to it,
right?
So, all right, interesting.
I was going to ask a little bit about. I know you work for consultants, municipalities, and probably some private clients as well. What are some of the common issues you see when you get samples, or some of the more common issues that cause some of the samples to be questionable? The data that either the way they're handing them over to you, not keeping them on ice, things like that. Just for our audience, so they can understand. Just common problems that you as the lab, when you get your samples, would like to see change, so to make the data more usable.
Yeah, I think in the process, it could be a variety of different things. I mean, I think, we brought up chain of custody a while back. I think legibility on the chain of custody, not everyone has that perfect penmanship.
That's coming back to us, Kris. No. I don't like this.
That's something. Right.
Yeah.
Something on that. Oh goodness. There's a variety of different things that I could bring up. The type of ink used on the labels in the on the jars. The samples get iced, so pretty much every sample that's collected needs to be preserved on ice at 4 degrees C plus or minus a certain limit. So the ice obviously is going to melt, and if you don't use the right type of ink on the label in the jar, it's going to come off, and then we can't tell what sample is what. Capping the jars properly. You're putting soil in a jar, you're going to get soil particles on the threads of the jar, and the ice is going to melt, the water's going to leak into the jar, and now you have a sample that is, in that case, is the sample's been compromised. Another big thing is, and this goes to the issue of the perfluorinated compounds. There are products with like firefighting foam, right, which is pretty much 100% perfluorinated compounds. We get that into the laboratory, and if you can imagine, you're in a laboratory that's designed to be detecting concentrations at the part per trillion level, and now we get 100% product into the lab. Well, that can shut you down for a week. It contaminates instrumentation, it contaminates glassware, it contaminates bench tops. It's that type of thing, and that goes back to this idea or concept of this partnering, right, with the laboratory. Is if you're collecting a sample that is very, very high concentration, it doesn't necessarily have to be, perfluorinated compounds, it could be anything. But you're collecting a sample that's very high in concentration of a particular compound or substance that you're trying to detect. The biggest thing is, give the lab a heads up, because we'll treat that differently, right? We'll handle the sample differently. We'll handle it differently in the laboratory to make sure that we don't end up with, contamination issues, cross-contaminating other samples, which happens.
Or one of your guys getting hurt or injured or, exposed or.
Right.
That's another big thing. For sure.
Yeah. Good point.
That's perfect. But, as technology continues to evolve, we talked about the parts per trillion, and who knows if we're going to quadrillion or whatever's next. What do you guys see on the horizon? Are there any compounds or contaminants you guys have your eyes on? Are you guys looking at anything, or this is something you want to keep hold to your vest, close to the vest for the moment?
I really don't know, and our business is really driven by regulation, right? As yours is as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's if there weren't a regulation for it, you wouldn't be addressing it. So we can look at things like personal care products, endocrine disruptors, you have some of these things that are on the horizon or potentially on the horizon, but there's no regulations for it. There's no treatment standards for them. You're not looking for these things necessarily in, water and wastewater. You're not looking for them in drinking water. There's really no methods for it. You brought up methods, a while back. And it's, they're there. We know they're there, but there's really nothing at this point that indicates there's any movement in that direction from the analytical standpoint. And there may be research going on that we're not aware of, but it's not really, it's not really something we see on the horizon yet.
Has Alpha ever been leading the development of a standard on how to analyze for a specific compound? Have you guys ever done that in the past?
Well, we are actually one of 7 laboratories that's involved in the multi-lab validation study for the new PFAS method, the new perfluorinated compound method, EPA 1633. So we are, as I had mentioned earlier in the session here, that each method that is developed goes through a method validation study. So we're one of 7 laboratories participating in that study.
Any idea when that's going to wrap up, or?
It's been going on for a long time. Yeah.
That's it's keeping us busy for sure.
Yeah.
It's been going on for a while, and it's going to continue, huh?
It looks like it. Yeah.
Oh man. Well, then back to your technicians. How hard is it to find people these days? I mean, on our side of the table, so to speak, in the consulting and engineering world, it's been a challenge lately. To say challenge is probably an understatement, and I'm sure you guys are in the same boat. But how are you finding staffing?
It's a full-time job for a staff of folks within our organization. It's not a I graduated from William Patterson College with a chemistry degree, and at the year I graduated, I think there were probably a couple hundred business majors, there were education majors, nursing majors. There were 3 of us in the chemistry department. I mean, it's just not it's not one of the more popular not one of the more popular majors, and it's difficult to find people. It's very difficult. We have a HR staff that's kind of chipping away at it every day.
I mean, I assume you're hiring right now, like the rest of us.
Yeah, we are. We do have a lot of open requisitions for hiring, and we are recruiting. We have close to 500 employees in our company, so we have
some impressive.
We are looking for people,
Yep.
as is everyone. I mean, there's a help wanted sign on every window that you pass these days.
And does the lab, do you guys operate in 2 shifts a day? Is it just a regular 8-hour day, 5 days a week, or is it 6 days a week? What's the typical operating schedule for the lab right now?
So for us, and it has been like this for a number of years, we operate 24/7. So we have 3 shifts. We have 3 shifts that operate
3
7 days a week. Yeah,
7 days a week too.
Yeah.
All right, that helps for sure.
Oh, and with COVID, I mean, that's not a job where you can work remotely either. So that presented a whole bunch of new issues. Staffing that, I imagine.
Right.
When now everyone's coming out of COVID, trying to get staff back in, you've kind of dealt with it the whole time.
Right. Yeah, that was a challenge because obviously you can't, prepare a sample from home. You have to be in the lab
to
do that, and
for sure.
You need the instrumentation. So yeah.
Oh wow, Kris, anything you want to ask before we wrap up for the day that we didn't cover?
I was just going to talk about some of the, obviously you're involved in a lot of professional business associations, groups, brownfield associations, things like that, where I know you're heavily involved in Alpha sponsors many events. You also kind of get on the board, which I think is very important because it kind of puts you really close to the consultants, the environmental attorneys, the developers, so you can kind of put yourself as part of the team. So I don't know if you want to talk about some of the associations that you see very beneficial in the tri-state area, kind of getting the word out and kind of spreading messages about environmental consulting work, redevelopment, brownfields. What are some of the associations that you kind of, you see doing a lot of good work in the neighborhood?
Yeah, so I can think of three in particular. One is the New York City Brownfield Partnership, which, I guess from a perspective of my participation in these groups is really to understand the regulations, understand some of the challenges that you folks are facing, right, from that point down, because that also helps to build that team, in terms of discussing projects with you, understanding what your objectives are with the data, understanding what new regulations are coming down the line. So being part of those, and the partnership, right, is really there to work together with, the mayor's office of environmental remediation, the consultant community, the laboratory community, vendors. So getting all of those folks together and having these, regulatory roundtables, these updates is very important to me to understand what's going on as a whole in the industry. The other one is Long Island Association of Professional Geologists, which, is a group that meets here on the island. And that too, there's been some very interesting topics related to issues and things going on specific to the island. There's a very unique environment here, right? There's a very unique ecosystem in this area, which I find very interesting. And the other one is the Brownfield Coalition of the Northeast, which again is more of a broader, a group that has a broader reach in terms of its geography. And so you get perspectives from different states. So you look at, Connecticut, New Jersey, some of the other states, and understanding their some of the challenges there, understanding the regulations that are coming down the line there, and what the requirements are. And that helps us as a laboratory, because as you can imagine, the more states you get involved with, the more standards you have to understand and comply with. And New York is different than New Jersey, is different than Connecticut, is different than Massachusetts. And so you kind of have to put an operation together that addresses all of these different aspects of environmental analysis.
What I like about Alpha also is you guys do periodically put out like some updates and informational like webinars, and you guys will inform us often as to what's going on with different contaminants or technologies and you guys as a whole. So that's also appreciated on the consultant side. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and it helps train some of our newer staff too to kind of get up to speed with
proper
sampling methodologies and techniques as well. So
Right.
So, Kevin, we're at the end of our time here, but is anything we didn't cover that you wanted to bring up or mention about the company or environmental sampling or analysis in general?
I don't really have anything more. I think we've covered a lot here
we did,
in this
for sure.
discussion, and I would be happy to participate in another one if you want to develop any of these ideas further. I really appreciate being here and appreciate the invite.
We will take you up on that, and we do thank you for joining us today. So just to recap, I want to thank our guest today, Kevin Hoogerhyde, Vice President of Technical Sales at Alpha Analytical, based out of Massachusetts, and I'm Kris Almskog, our Senior Vice President at PWGC, who heads the Environmental Compliance Division. And again, I'm your host, Paul Boyce, CEO and President of PWGC. Lastly, just to reiterate, if you guys want to reach us, www.pwgrocer.com/podcast. This is the Environmental Echo, and I thank our listeners for joining us.